Hey there, welcome to Season 2 of the BlockCrunch podcast, where we condense insights from builders and investors in the blockchain space. I'm your host, Jason Choi. And in this season, we'll be talking to more developers and researchers to bring you the biggest challenges and latest innovations in the world of crypto. We will be talking to Lane Rettig, a core developer from Ethereum, about two of the existential challenges facing Ethereum today. We will be covering a lot of initiatives in place related to governance, as well as giving you a 30,000 feet view of all the scalability solutions currently being explored by the Ethereum community. And Lane and I actually recorded this as a 1-hour special just because of how much there is to cover, but I decided to split it into two parts since the first part, dealing with governance, is much more intuitive for even non-technical listeners, whereas the second part, dealing with everything scalability, does require some understanding of terms such as nodes, proof of work, and proof of stake. So if you have no clue what those mean, don't worry at all, because there are plenty of great resources online that you can get started with. And this is one of my favorite episodes that we ever did on the show, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast and get notifications for the second part of the discussion. But without further ado, here is Lane Rettig discussing all things related to Ethereum governance.
This is a worldwide phenomenon.
And today we are really excited to be talking to Lane Rettig. Lane is a core developer for Ethereum, the founder of New York's first crypto co-working space, Crypto NYC, and is an active member in the Ethereum community, often traveling around the world, which suits him very well because he speaks more languages than I can remember. And Lane and I went to the same school, actually, but we met officially late 2017 in New York. And talking with Lane was one of the big catalysts behind me dedicating basically all my time to this space. So Lane, very excited to finally have you here.
Hey, Jason. Thrilled to be here as well. That's a fantastic introduction. And I'll just add that your level of enthusiasm when you and I met last year, which was kind of when I was on the way down the rabbit hole myself and my own kind of journey, was great to see and was definitely kind of a motivating factor for me as well.
I'm very glad to hear that. And I would love to theme our discussion around the two main issues or challenges facing Ethereum today. And they're essentially scaling and governance, since they are central to the functioning of pretty much any decentralized network that affects developers, entrepreneurs, and investors alike. And I would like to take this time to kind of dive deep into your thoughts as not only a core developer, but as someone who's very much in touch with everything that's happening with Ethereum communities around the world, and attempt to maybe map out some of the initiatives and issues in governance and scaling today in a very high level. But first, let's start with having you walk us through your background a bit and how you're involved in the crypto world.
Sure. Do you want the short version, the medium version, or the long version? I have a feeling that I tend to kind of talk longer than I should sometimes in these things. So it's up to you.
Anything you want.
All right. Let's see. I'm a software developer. I've been a software developer my entire career and my entire life, for that matter. I got my first computer when I was probably only 3 or 4 years old. And I'm a little older than a lot of the folks in this space. I'm 35 right now. So we're talking about, kind of like mid 80s here. So this was like super early days of computing. And I began coding when I was 7 or 8 years old, using tools like BASIC. And I've been doing it since then. So professionally now for, something like 12 or 13, 14 years. I studied computer science at Berkeley, at UC Berkeley. So I have an undergrad degree in CS. And that's been kind of the constant thread throughout my life and throughout my career. I've always been a coder. I've always been super, 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 super passionate about technology and about programming languages and about, cutting edge kind of new technology. And then the other stuff has kind of bounced around a bit. I know, Jason, you and I sort of, geeked out about some of this when we first met. I also studied Japanese and Chinese and spent a big chunk of my life working, studying, living, traveling out in that part of the world. Career-wise, I began my career at a hedge fund, at a quantitative hedge fund here in New York in 2006. And after a couple of years, they moved me out to Hong Kong. So I was out there for quite some time. I began dabbling in entrepreneurship around that time. So this is kind of like the 2010, 2011 timeframe. And then in 2012, I came back to the States. So I left that job. I moved back from Hong Kong. And I went to business school and got an MBA and did a second master's in international studies. So again, kind of these two parallel threads. And entrepreneurship was a big shift for me. And it was really, how do I describe it? It was really like terrifying in the beginning because I was kind of stepping out of this structured system that I had been a part of. I had been on this sort of career track basically my entire life up to that point. But it was also very eye-opening and very exciting and liberating in a way. That's what I remember, this mix of sort of fear, but also this exciting, liberating feeling when I chose the entrepreneurial path. I worked on a few startups. Most notably, one was a healthcare technology startup called Ceratis for about 3 years that I founded during business school. Sold the company in 2016. And then I actually immediately started another company following that, and worked on it for a few months alone and realized I just needed some time off. And I had some big, deep questions I didn't have answers to because I calculated that at that point I had been going nonstop for 10 years from undergrad through the career, through business school, through the startup without really taking any time off. So I took a year-long sabbatical. I did a lot of travel, a lot of meditation, a lot of thinking and soul searching. And it was during that time, so now into early 2017, last year, when I sort of stumbled upon Ethereum at a tech conference in Europe, actually. And of course, I'd heard of Ethereum and I had heard quite a bit and read a bit about Bitcoin at that point, but it never really clicked for me. What really clicked for me at the beginning, so the aha moment in the beginning of my journey here in blockchain and Ethereum was just sitting down with very smart people and understanding the concept of a smart contract, like what that actually means, what the implications of that idea are. And from there, this was, again, early 2017. It's been head over heels, like down the rabbit hole, and I haven't looked back since then.
That's awesome. And for what you're working on now, can you talk a little bit about what your involvement with Ethereum is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I've sort of had my hands in a few things since entering the space last year. And I struggle with this a lot. Number one, I definitely am the ADHD type. So I definitely sort of get bored easily and feel myself pulled in different directions. And to make matters even worse, there's just so much that needs doing in this space right now. So it's especially tempting. It's especially difficult to do one thing. I actually made an effort, I think just yesterday, to record all of the different things I'm kind of doing and excited about as part of an ongoing process to figure out how to focus better and what to focus better on. And I won't tell you how many things were on that list or how long it was, but it was a little intimidating to actually see it. So I guess the sort of short answer is primarily I'm focused. So I'm a core developer. I'm doing coding work, right? So actually writing code. Believe it or not, some people are surprised to hear that I code. Working on a project called EWASM, which stands for Ethereum Flavored WebAssembly. And that is an initiative to basically reimagine, reinvent, and just replace the Ethereum virtual machine with a kind of upgraded, better virtual machine, better execution engine. And that's part of the longer term Ethereum roadmap, including things like sharding and Casper. I do that as part of a team of 9 or 10 other core developers who are actually scattered all around the world, which is kind of cool, hence all the travel.
Got it. That's awesome. And before we dive into EWASM, I'd like to start with a discussion about governance, since it lets us have a good framework to discuss how these initiatives within Ethereum are being coordinated. And you've written before that you don't believe we can have a mature system that's apolitical. And the point isn't to avoid politics, but to actually build a better system of governance for Ethereum. So in your opinion, what is a better system?
That's an excellent question. Yeah, I mean, just a tiny bit of background here before attempting to answer the question. I think what we have to understand and appreciate is that Ethereum is this beautiful, wonderful, fascinating thing. I mean, I really mean that. Those aren't platitudes. I really wake up in the morning excited to work on the project and shaking my head at just the wonder of the whole thing. I mean, wonder is really a good word. But the thing is, right, the sort of personalities and people and organizations that have been primarily involved in Ethereum up to now and into, in getting it to where it's at, they're not, I mean, they're brilliant technical minds, but with some notable exceptions, they're not people who have, let's say, deep expertise in things like governance or social systems, social sciences, political science, all these sorts of things, laws, another good example, ethics, et cetera, et cetera. And so they tend to think in sort of mathematical terms along the lines of things like economics and game theory, right? There's a lot of game theory that goes into Ethereum. And I guess that's reflected in the software. It's reflected in the community today. And I think what's so interesting about Ethereum right now is that, we're at an inflection point. It's a system that has tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of users. But in order for it to get to the next level, to sort of get past this inflection point and to sort of begin really going mainstream, the case I make is that we really need a more mature, more sort of well thought out and designed governance system. Everything up to now has been very haphazard as a result of some of the kind of cultural factors that I described. Right. So the question you're asking is, what does better governance look like? I don't in any way, shape, or form pretend to know the answer to that question. This is, I'm not an expert in these things either. We always joke and say kind of there are no experts in this space right now, which I think is very true. What I will say is that we need, maybe more than governance, maybe what we need at this moment is sort of meta governance. And what I mean by that is, like, while I don't know the answer to the question of kind of what is the right governance for Ethereum, I do know that we need to have that conversation. And so we need these initiatives and these conversations and these sort of projects to explore that and engage experts and engage community members and hopefully arrive at the answer to your question together.
Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting point about kind of bringing in external experts maybe to look at the more human or governance aspects of this. And I think one of the more well-documented processes in how Ethereum is governed is the Ethereum Improvement Proposal process. So for our listeners, currently improvements to Ethereum are made through these things called EIPs, or Ethereum Improvement Proposals. So my question to you is, who can submit these proposals and what is the approval process like for these?
This is a very timely question. I'm not sure if you follow Gitter or any of the kind of governance related channels. There's a one main channel, which is Gitter, of course, is the chat sort of client that's attached to GitHub. And it's the main communication channel, public channel for a lot of Ethereum related stuff, just because, again, a lot of us are coders and we spend all day on GitHub anyway. So there is a governance channel at gitter.im/Ethereum/governance. There's also another channel which is closely related, which is gitter.im/Ethereum/allcoredevs. And there's been a raging conversation, I mean, to the order of, thousands of messages literally in the past 48 hours in the governance channel on exactly this topic. So I can answer your question. I can tell you kind of what the process looks like today, but I just want to point out that, again, this is what's so exciting about being in Ethereum today, is that all of this is evolving, right? Nothing, like, it's the exact opposite. You look at sort of quote unquote real world governance, you look at, governments like the government of the United States. And like, I think many people today, I look at it and I think it's awful. It's a mess. There's a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of things that need to change about the system. I feel powerless to change it. I feel, I don't know what the right word is, a little bit of apathy, which is a bit scary because, of course, government is important. It's something that we should all be involved in. But I just want to emphasize that Ethereum is the exact opposite. It's this primordial thing that's sort of just forming right now. And so it's actually a really exciting time to be part of this conversation. So the short answer, I think your question was sort of who can submit an EIP and what does the approval process look like? Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so the short answer is anyone who has a GitHub account is welcome to submit an EIP. It's just a set of issues and pull requests on the github.com/Ethereum/EIPs, that's spelled EIPS, repository. And we have a set of what are called EIP reviewers. So these are individuals such as Hudson Jameson and Nick Johnson and several others who review them. And there's usually some back and forth to help the submitter get the EIP to a place where it's technically sound. And there's a set of statuses that is applied to them. Something is marked as a draft. And then, the drafts go to something called last call. And at some point after that, when they're deemed to be technologically sound, and ideally when there's at least one implementation, one sample implementation attached to it as a pull request, then it could be brought up on the All Core Devs call, which happens every 2 weeks. And after being brought up on the call, if it's approved or if there's no objections to it, then it would be marked as final, and basically the core developers would decide to implement it at that point and maybe schedule it for a future hard fork. I may have actually gotten one or two steps in this process wrong because, again, it's sort of in the process of evolving right now. But there are some interesting outstanding questions right now. I think the biggest one, and these are the things that I mentioned are being debated right now, both at the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians gathering we had in Berlin, and then following on that on the governance channel I mentioned. One is sort of, is it the responsibility of the core devs to evaluate these proposals not just along technological lines, but also along what we call philosophical lines, right? So that's sort of the economic, legal, political aspect of things. Also, is it the responsibility of the person submitting the proposal to actually submit an implementation, right? What if the person submitting the proposal is not technical? Should it be a strictly technical process? Should we facilitate contributions from other community members who are not technical? Another big question right now is there actually formally voting on things, or is it more just a veto-like system where as long as no one objects, no core developer, basically has a large objection, then something will get scheduled. There's a question about controversial versus non-controversial EIPs and several other questions. All of these are just being hotly debated right now.
And that's actually leads right into my next question, because it sounds like a very organic process in that we have developers who are manually reviewing the proposals. So my question to you is there anything in place or any discussions in place to think about how to minimize the effect of personal biases? What if, say, a reviewer is philosophically against an update that is technically sound? Can he or she swing the decision to reject the proposal just on kind of personal philosophical grounds?
So just to make sure I understand your question, you're saying, for example, a core developer who may feel that a particular EIP, a particular proposal is technologically sound, but might disagree with it for some other reason. So some sort of philosophical, ethical, economic, legal reason. Is that the question?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I wish I had a simple answer to these questions. I mean, it's right. Again, I'm just trying to make the point that governance is a conversation, and I don't sort of claim to have answers. I think that is exactly the question that's being debated right now. I think there's two ways to look at it, right? There's kind of, what is the reality on the ground today, regardless of what the rules may be? And just to be clear, the rules around the EIP process, right? This is the one piece of Ethereum governance in which the rules are fairly well codified. They're encoded into something called EIP 1, which you can read on that repository. So there's the way things work today, which, as I said, so there's sort of the written rules, right? There's the practical matter of how things actually happen today. And then there's also sort of the ideal, how we want things to be in the future. And so I think there's maybe sort of as many as three answers to some of these questions. I believe the answer to this question is that the rules, there's been some changes recently. I'm not exactly sure what they say about this, but I think that they suggest that the EIP process is intended to be technical. And so there isn't really grounds for objecting to an EIP on not a non-technical basis. That's kind of, I believe that may be the current state of EIP 1, although, as I said, it's changed recently. And that is a particular thing that's been questioned. And then as for what actually happens, we're all human, right? All core developers are just people. And so I think that if they were really uncomfortable with a particular proposal, I mean, I think what happens today is it just doesn't get brought up. The really controversial proposals haven't sort of come to, an explicit vote or anything on these calls.
Mm-hmm. Got it. I see. And kind of moving to a very kind of, I guess, controversial point as well. I think a lot of people have been saying that Vitalik Buterin, who of course is the co-founder of Ethereum, has been called almost a benevolent dictator in that he has at least some disproportional power over some decisions that are made in Ethereum. And he himself has said that most of the power he has is basically just soft power, or basically maybe the weight that people put on his suggestions and opinions because of who he is. So do you see this happening? And do you think this is something that will change over time if it is happening now?
I agree with what Vitalik said, right? I agree with the kind of the soft power argument. I think many other core developers and community members, think very highly of Vitalik and greatly respect his opinion on matters, especially technical matters. But I think to believe that a dictator is a strong word, right? And to believe that any person, no matter who they are, even if they're Vitalik, could in some way single-handedly succeed in having some change made to the protocol that the rest of the community didn't agree with, right? And just let's be clear, that is the definition of a dictator, right? Is someone who can single-handedly execute decisions, right? I think that would be to greatly misunderstand Ethereum and the Ethereum governance process. And, to use this as an example, I've heard, I believe it maybe was Vitalik himself who cited this example. If he were, God forbid, captured, and there was some sort of power or some foreign government or something who had a gun to his head and told him to, tell the Ethereum community that we're going to execute a hard fork and we're going to insert $1 billion into, someone else's account. Of course, that wouldn't happen. And so I don't think he or anyone else in the community have that power. And I think, again, this may be fairly obvious, but to kind of reemphasize this point, I think that is part of the beauty of Ethereum today, is that it's in many ways anti-fragile and sort of resistant to that sort of attack for various reasons.
And you spoke about how Vitalik basically can't fork the community if he wants to. So I'd like to talk more about the community as well. And in May of 2018 in Toronto, there were some key developers, yourself included, and instrumental players that came together for a meeting called EIP0 to discuss governance and community. So I know there have been kind of consistent follow-up meetings in different forms after that. So I just wanted to see, what are some of the main takeaways from that series of meetings so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to lay the groundwork here a little bit, I'm familiar with two distinct but related governance initiatives in the Ethereum community today. And I think people often confuse them, and that's not surprising given that they have a lot in common. And we haven't been terribly clear on the messaging around this. The first one is called the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians. And that's an initiative that was launched, I want to say late last year or maybe early this year, by Greg Colvin and Jamie Pitts. And Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians it's hard to characterize it. It's sort of a loose affiliation of technologically minded people who care a great deal about the Ethereum technology platform and the community, and have decided voluntarily to come together and basically debate the technology. Right. So take some sort of technological stewardship of Ethereum. That's the first initiative. That initiative is a little bit more mature. There have been now 2 in-person gatherings. The first one was in Paris on the sidelines of ETHCC in March, I think. And the second one was just this past weekend in Berlin, which is where I just came back from. The other initiative, the one you're referring to, is called EIP0. This is one that I helped get off the ground along with a few other folks such as Griff Green and John Light from the Aragon team. And they're very similar in the sense that they're sort of more memes than anything else. They're just sort of pure grassroots, right? There's no, what I mean when I say a meme, and I'm borrowing this idea from Reese Lindmark here, right, is that there's not sort of a official company or organization behind it. There isn't even really a person or a set of members behind it. It's kind of this, like, as I said, sort of a loose affiliation of interested individuals, and it's sort of the right set of people are the people who are there, and the right time to do it is the time that you choose to do it. A lot of this is borrowed from the IETF, by the way. And so to differentiate the two, so whereas the Fellowship of Ethereum Magicians is very focused on the technological stewardship of Ethereum, I began feeling very strongly that the other stuff, which we alluded to before, that's the philosophical, political, economic, legal, ... side of governance, right, was not sort of being adequately addressed. And to be very clear, right, that's not at all the intention of the magicians. So we launched that initiative with a workshop, I guess you could call it, in Toronto alongside EdCon. And my sense of time is completely screwed up now, but I think that was something like May. And I believe this is another very roundabout question in one of your answers, but I think the question you were asking is what were kind of some things or takeaways that came out of that initiative?
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest one is signaling. And we've spoken about this, and there have been some articles written about this. Speaking as a core developer and just remembering what other people expressed at EIP0, there's a lot of frustration with the poor quality of signals we have today. And when we try to make decisions or even have discussions about what's best for Ethereum, that's very, very difficult when we don't really know who the community members are. So that's a tangent here as well, right? It's sort of community. What does that actually mean? who's in the community, where do we draw the line? That's another thing we had a breakout session on in the unconference that we did at EIP 0. Both of these are huge questions, very closely related, right? What's the community, and how do we understand community sentiment? We have things like coin votes and carbon votes, which are polls that allow people to vote based on their ether balances, but there seems to be consensus that they're pretty bad. I mean, maybe it's better than nothing, right? It's certainly one signal, but they're bad for a variety of reasons. They're bad because of how they're executed. They're bad because they promote plutarchy, and that's sort of not the Ethereum that we want to live in. So those are the two immediate takeaways that come to mind, and they're ongoing challenges.
I see. And in terms of determining who's a part of the Ethereum community, are there any discussions ongoing that basically helps categorize different parts of the community? Because I assume that you guys probably think about core developers and users and maybe partners a little differently about what roles they play in the ecosystem. So is there like a categorization system in place to think about the community itself?
Yeah, that is actually specifically something that we worked on at EIP 0, and we did some whiteboarding on it, and I believe we came up with a list of something like 10 to 12 different groups of stakeholders. I won't be able to list all of them out of my memory right now, but just to list a few, that definitely includes core developers, EIP editors, which are closely related to that. It includes exchanges who are very influential. It includes miners who have some degree of influence and obviously play an important role in the ecosystem. It includes hodlers, sort of holders. It includes just ordinary kind of users who transact in Ethereum. It includes DApp developers and DApp users, right? So that's a few of the categories. And it is definitely interesting to analyze these different categories in comparison to one another, because they are quite distinct, and they have, in fact, sometimes very differing or even opposite interests. So just as one random example, DApp users, and for that matter, developers, actually want the sort of transaction costs to be low on Ethereum. And that makes sense, right? Because they don't want it to be expensive for someone to interact with their application. On the flip side, miners want fees to be as high as possible. So we immediately have diverging interests, which I think is one thing that makes aggregating community sentiment very difficult. And there's also overlap, which makes it even more complicated. I definitely fall into 3 or 4, at least, of those categories, and I'm sure you and many other people do as well.
Yeah, and I think that was a great overview of a lot of the initiatives that are concerning with governance in Ethereum. But before we kind of shift gears to scaling, there's a question that I'm always personally curious for, is how are developers and contributors for Ethereum compensated? Is it through bounties or salaries? If so, who determines it? And are they paid in Ether?
Another question to which there's no simple answer. I mean, it's a very diverse ecosystem, and I can only really speak about my own experience. And I think that many sort of different individuals in different of those categories throughout the ecosystem probably have very different compensation structures. I'll give you kind of two answers. I'll tell you a little bit about how things look from my perspective, and then I'll tell you a little bit about maybe how things look from the ecosystem perspective, which I think is interesting. I actually just wrote an article a few days ago called So You Think You Want to Be a Core Developer? And I spoke a little bit about the role of core developer, how it's not particularly glamorous and the compensation is not particularly good. I think that's a reality, but it has, I also said that it has a lot of intangible benefits, and certainly being part of these conversations and having a role, no matter how small, in kind of guiding the future of Ethereum counts for a lot. So it's exciting for reasons that are not strictly financial. So the Ethereum Foundation definitely employs a lot of people we consider core developers. The vast majority of those are contractors, and they have the choice of being paid in fiat or in Ether, or I guess potentially in some combination of those two. In my case, I don't work for the Ethereum Foundation. I have a grant from the foundation, which is a little bit different. The structure is a little bit different. There's at least one other person on my team, on the EWASM team, who also has a grant. But I also know that core developers who work for other projects and companies, I'm sure some of them are employees, for example. So I don't know the details of the Parity team or other core development teams, but I suspect that you have, it runs the gamut, right? There's no simple answer. I just wanted to mention from the ecosystem perspective, this is a big challenge. We have a little bit of a tragedy of the commons situation right now. And I think that a lot of core work, so part of that is core development. I'll give you another great example here, the EIP editors. So there's officially, I think, 5 people who do it, but in practice, it's like a lot of the burden falls upon Nick Johnson right now. And Nick is not paid for this work, right? It could easily be a full-time job. There are many, many, many hundreds of EIPs and related kind of proposals and things that come into the EIP repository as PRs and as issues. And he basically does it as a volunteer. And we had a conversation about this recently as part of that governance channel conversation I mentioned a few minutes ago. If the volume of these continues to increase, we don't really know what happens, right? Either someone somewhere needs to step up and actually stump up some money and hire more EIP editors, or there's going to be an increasing bottleneck. Another example is the all core devs calls, which Hudson Jameson is primarily responsible for organizing and which I help run sometimes. That's also kind of a volunteer thing. So I just think there's interesting questions here around whose responsibility it is in the ecosystem to fund this sort of public good, let's call it. So one example of a public good are these roles that I'm describing. I think there's many other examples of kind of infrastructure stuff that we may need to find better funding mechanisms for.
So that concludes the first part of the discussion about Ethereum's governance. If you're interested in learning more about Ethereum scalability initiatives, then definitely subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And you can follow me on Twitter at Mr. Jason Choi as well, where I'll be sharing the second part of this discussion, which is the next episode, which we will release next week. With that being said, I've been your host, Jason Choi. This has been the Block Crunch Podcast, and I look forward to seeing you at the next episode.